Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this build series where we are putting together the 84-inch Lavochkin La-7 from CYModel. In this episode, we are going to concentrate on everything in the tail. Now, in the previous episodes, we've already talked about gluing in the control horns and setting up the pin hinges, but in this episode, we're going to concentrate on gluing on and attaching the horizontal stab, setting up the pull for the rudder, and making sure the servos are installed, linkages are all set, and everything in the tail is ready to go. So without any further ado, let's head over to the bench and get to work. We'll start with showing the control horns for the elevators. You'll have to trim them. You can see the line is right around the middle of that bottom hole, but measure for yourself to trim those up and sand those smooth. This next shot is of the rudder control horns, and while they're slightly different, I just wanted to give you a close-up shot what they look like. And you're gonna have to find center because you can see the seam of the covering is not exactly center, so find a way to make sure those are perfectly centered within the rudder. In previous episodes, and I have a link to one right here, we've talked about mounting the control horns, taping these off, cutting the covering, so I'm not going to go into that detail here, but we do the same process for mounting these control horns. The rudder and both elevators are again hinged with pin hinges, and again we've talked about how to use epoxy for these pin hinges, so I'm not going to go into that detail here, but just wanted to show you a shot of before I went ahead and glued the pin hinges in the back. For the elevator push rods, you're going to have a long piece of carbon tube with one end being a turnbuckle and the other end a longer piece of rod. So I just glued these in with the epoxy and actually added one more step, put a piece of shrink wrap over these connections, and we should be good. There are no holes marked for the wires for the pull to go into the fuselage and for the holes of the elevator push rods. So what I did here was just to eyeball things from the back, I put some music wire in the holes of the control arms of the servos so I can gauge and basically see where to poke those holes through. So it's a little bit of a guessing game, but that's just one trick that I did to try to get those holes into the fuselage correctly. I'd love for there to be a little mark or something from the factory to guide you, but you are kind of playing it by ear, so take your time. So here I'm using a laser level to match the elevator halves. I haven't glued the stabs on yet, but I did that because I wanted to measure the incidence between the rear stab and the wing. And I came out to right about the main wings are about +2% and the rear stabs are about +1%. So I wanted to gauge this before I glued to know if I needed to make any adjustments, and things were pretty good. So I just wanted to show you some of these shots. Now we're going to prepare to glue the stabs onto the rear of the fuselage. And here I have a Dremel sanding drum that I'm just kind of using to scuff up this paint. And I'm not trying to sand, I'm not trying to take away or make anything smaller. I'm just trying to scuff this up so we can have some more surface area for the epoxy to adhere to. We're going to do the same thing with the stab itself. In fact, I'm going to start with some finer sandpaper just to rough up some of that balsa, and you have to be careful. You don't want to rough up the covering that's kind of over the end there, and you also want to clean up that little post because there's usually some paint on there. And now here I got some rougher sandpaper, and again I'm just trying to make some grooves in this side so we can create a good adhesion with the epoxy. And now I've mixed up my epoxy and I'm just going to coat this side. And remember to get some epoxy in the hole in the front, the anti-rotation pin for the stab. And we're going to try to get a good coating of epoxy in the stab tube hole. So we'll go ahead and fast forward through this and show you what this looks like. And whenever you're epoxying something like this, make sure to have some alcohol around with some paper towels to clean up some of the excess glue. And here's a shot of just preparing the glue, the epoxy onto the stab itself. Make sure to cover that anti-rotation pin with some epoxy, as well as put some epoxy into the stab tube hole that I just showed right here. So we'll speed through this, and here is a shot for the stab already covered with epoxy, the anti-rotation pin. There's some epoxy in the tube hole, and we're ready to go ahead and install this. As we push through the stab tube, we'll make sure we rotate it and add a little bit of epoxy as we put it in. Make sure keeping it rotated to create that good barrier of epoxy as we insert that in. Because once this is glued, that tube is in there for good. Now we'll take the stab itself, and what I'm going to do is, remember I have some epoxy in the hole here, I'm going to actually rotate the tube as I insert the stab onto it. As we get closer to the fuse, we'll go ahead and insert that anti-rotation pin, and we'll be good to go. So I'm only showing one of the stabs, but when you glue the other one, I'm assuming you'd probably want to do it at the same time. I personally set up a jig to, as they're both clamped on, to sort of clamp the stabs together to the fuse. And that's what this shot is showing right here. You can see I have a board in the vise that's on the end of my table, and I have another board squeezing these together. And in fact, I'm using the laser level again to make sure that both stabs are level. And in fact, if you look closely there, you can see that I had to adjust it a little bit. I took that picture before I adjusted it. All right, so on to the rudder servo. I didn't like how close these three were, so I had a spare servo mounting block that I went ahead and glued in, and that's what this shot is showing. I epoxied this block a little bit ahead of the others, and this is just going to also raise the pull wires away from the elevator push rod. So we get this glued in, hook up the arm, and we can see here we're starting to use and hook up the pull wires. Now I needed to find larger crimps because the one that came with the kit didn't allow me to run the wire through twice, so I found some bigger ones that worked out just fine. We'll go to the back, and this is a finished crimp minus trimming that extra piece of wire, but I basically run it through the connector and then through the crimp twice, 2 crimps at an angle and a drop of CA in there to dry overnight, and we're good to go. And here are the servos working. You see the two 9380s for the elevators and the D645MW on the rudder. We have everything hooked up now, so we'll have some shots of these servos working. I got really good results matching the elevator servos, programming the 9380s with the DPC-11, as well as programming the 645 with the DPC-11, and I'll have videos for those linked up here in the corner now. So let's move on to the tail wheel. Pretty self-explanatory. There are no pre-drilled holes, so you're going to have to find the center of the bottom of the fuse and drill 3 holes, and then use the socket head screws to attach the tail wheel. So we have the bracket there, and then there's a 2-piece little nut that secures, that allows for the 3mm tail wheel assembly. So we'll tighten this first. And then we're going to take the actual tail wheel assembly or axle, slide it through, and we're going to have a collet on the top and the bottom to hold it in place. Your mileage may vary. I needed to replace some of these grub screws, so just be careful, don't over tighten anything, and that's kind of hard to say because you need to have these tight, so just be aware. You have the arm on top, or on this case the bottom because the plane's upside down, and then the collet on the bottom to hold the axle in place. On the axle itself, you have a little spacer, then you put the wheel on, and then finally one last collet adapter on the end of that axle, and we're good to go. We'll save putting the springs on until the last episode. All right, that's it. Everything in the tail minus the tail wheel springs. We'll get to that later, but we got the elevators matched, connected, the elevator servos, the push rods. We glued the horizontal stabs in together. We set up the rudder. We pin hinged the rudder in the elevators. We set up the pull cables, the pull servo, and we are good for the tail section. So everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode. The next episode is going to be everything up front. We're going to mount the motor, the cowling, and go from there. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.